In a previous video, we discussed algorithms and personalization, and particularly interesting moral questions that may arise from their use. We talked about the ways in which human biases can be perpetuated by seemingly neutral computational algorithms. In this video, we'll extend this discussion by considering a particular type of bias that might be perpetuated: racial bias.
In Searching for Black Girls, the second chapter of Algorithms of Oppression, Sophia Noble shows her readers some sample Google search results that seem to indicate racist biases. Specifically, she shows the results for searches on terms like black girls, unprofessional hairstyles, and 3 black teenagers, among others.
When Noble published her chapter, Google searches for those terms gave results that matched offensive stereotypes. And while the results for some of these search terms have been cleaned up or fixed by Google since the publication of Noble's book, the results for other search terms are still problematic. Just take a look at the current Google search results for Asian girls. You might think, okay, search results depict unfortunate stereotypes. But so what? People should get the information they're looking for, even if others take offense. And search engines should not have to sanitize the internet to appease certain offended groups.
But, Noble argues, these search results cause real harm. One thing in particular that worries Noble is that people outside of a specific group have power over how that group is represented. The result is that one's identity is entirely externally defined. The group has little, if any, control over how they're represented.
While this is a sort of general harm, Noble also cites more particular, specific harms that result from this. For example, she notes studies on media representation and perception. Thomas E. Ford found that both blacks and whites who view blacks negatively on television are more likely to hold negative perceptions of them or themselves. As another example, Yuki Fujioka notes that in the absence of positive first-hand experience, stereotypical media portrayals of blacks on television are highly likely to affect perceptions of the group.
Yet another example is that stereotypical depictions of women and minorities in advertising impact the behavior of those who consume it. And one final example I'll offer, while noting that this does not make a complete list of the potential harms, is that the transmission of stereotypes about women in advertising creates a limited vocabulary of intention, encouraging people to think and speak of women primarily in terms of their relationship to men, family, or their sexuality.
Another important, related point that Noble argues for is that the reproduction of racial hierarchies online is a manifestation of the same sorts of problems and biases that exist offline. This is made evident by the ways in which search results disproportionately sexualize and objectify girls, black girls in particular. However, many people assume that search algorithms are neutral, unbiased, and objective, but this works to mask the problem. This common assumption effectively magnifies the effects of the harms we just mentioned by making it harder to even see those problems and making it much more difficult to address them. One interesting question we should immediately ask when confronted with these kinds of skewed results is, whose fault is this? Who is responsible?
Typically, when confronted with the evidence of bias in their search results, Google has responded by denying responsibility for the bias in the results, or by denying that they intended to harm anyone.
But interestingly, when confronted with these problems, Google has found ways to fix their algorithm so that the particular problem mentioned is no longer a problem. For example, a search for 3 black teenagers no longer returns an overwhelming amount of mugshots of black teenagers. So, at least in specific cases, it seems that Google can find solutions to these problems.
So, in light of the fact that it seems that Google can solve these problems, we might ask, are they responsible for doing so? Or, in other words, would they be doing something wrong if they didn't do so? Google might argue that they did not intend the potential harms caused by their search results, and thus, they're not morally responsible for those harms. PDE. Oh, excuse me.
In reply to the claim by tech companies that they do not intend for their algorithms to output problematic search results, Noble argues a bluntly consequentialist line. She says, "Many people say to me, but tech companies don't mean to be racist. That's not their intent. Intent is not particularly important. Outcomes and results are important."
One of the ways in which Noble thinks we can begin to solve some of these problems is by requiring the folks who are designing and producing the relevant tools to be trained in the history of marginalized groups. For example, by requiring computer engineering students to take courses in these subjects during their academic training. As well as by having the engineers work alongside folks who have been extensively trained in these areas while designing the relevant tools.
One question that we might ask, which Noble doesn't explicitly raise, is what should we, users of products like Google, do about all of this, if anything? Do we share some of the responsibility? We'll leave this question open for you to ponder.
On a slightly different but related note, you might worry about any solutions that might approach the possibility of limiting or somehow censoring free speech on the internet. It may seem obvious that we enjoy a greater degree of free speech because of the invention of the internet and because of companies like Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. And in some sense, that's likely true. There's a sense in which one's free speech is just an expressive action performed by an individual or a group of individuals.
But when we think about free speech, there's another important sense in which we think about it, as the access to important information and the ability to disseminate this information. Or, in other words, free speech is also important because it is a means to other valuable things. Some people worry that when we have this sense of free speech in mind, the idea that we have a greater degree of free speech after the invention of the internet is not necessarily true.
One such person is Zeynep Tufekci. She notes that viewing free speech purely as an end in itself and not also as a means to other valuable things can prevent us from acquiring those things altogether. In the liberal tradition, free speech is usually understood as a vehicle, as a necessary condition for achieving certain other societal ideals, for creating a knowledgeable public, for engendering healthy, rational, and informed debate, for holding powerful people and institutions accountable, for keeping communities lively and vibrant. What we are seeing now is that when free speech is treated as an end and not a means, it is all too possible to thwart and distort everything it is supposed to deliver.
So Tufekci thinks that solely pursuing free speech as freedom of expression will hinder us from achieving things like an informed public, rigorous public discourse, and the accountability of powerful people and institutions. But how does the sole pursuit of freedom of expression prevent us from achieving these valuable things?
But this worry would only make sense if there were some form of censorship possible in the internet age. In the past, this sort of censorship of ideas was clearly possible, given that there were relatively few media outlets. One would only have to threaten, bribe, or otherwise coerce the mouthpieces for these outlets into silence in order to stop their dissemination of particular ideas or information.
Yes, and Tufekci makes this point clear with an unbelievable historical event. For most of modern history, the easiest way to block the spread of an idea was to keep it from being mechanically disseminated. Shutter the newspaper, pressure the broadcast chief, install an official censor at the publishing house, or, if push came to shove, hold a loaded gun to the announcer's head. This actually happened once in Turkey. It was the spring of 1960, and a group of military officers had just seized control of the government and the national media, imposing an information blackout to suppress the coordination of any threats to their coup. But inconveniently for the conspirators, a highly anticipated soccer game between Turkey and Scotland was scheduled to take place in the capital 2 weeks after their takeover. Matches like this were broadcast live on national radio with an announcer calling the game play-by-play. People all across Turkey would huddle around their sets, cheering on the national team. Canceling the match was too risky for the junta. Doing so might incite a protest. But what if the announcer said something political on live radio? A single remark could tip the country into chaos. So, the officers came up with the obvious solution. They kept several guns trained on the announcer for the entire 2 hours and 45 minutes of the live broadcast.
So, the natural question to ask is censorship possible in the internet age? Clearly, individuals have much better access to platforms from which they can express their ideas than they did in the past. But are there ways that free speech, as a means to other valuable things, can be censored such that it no longer acts as a means to those things?
Tufekci says, yes. Social media algorithms provide new ways to exploit people's attention to censor certain ideas. 3 content delivery features enable this exploitation: mass surveillance, individualized transmission, and engagement prioritization. Due to the data collected via mass surveillance of our behavior, both online and off, there are highly individualized and specific profiles of each of us available for a price from data brokers. These profiles make it possible to send content to certain individuals and not others, which makes the transmission of this content non-public, unlike a public television or radio broadcast.
In addition to mass surveillance and individualized transmission, social media algorithms prioritize engagement. What this means is that the algorithms are designed to get you to stay on the social media platform for as long as possible and to click, scroll, comment, like, follow, subscribe, etc. In terms of algorithm design, this requires prioritizing content that is novel, that affirms our identity or establishes a sense of belonging, or sparks outrage. Psychologically, it's hard for us to resist these kinds of content.
Bad actors can take advantage of all 3 of these content delivery features to influence our behavior. For example, a partisan fake news article can be sent to a particular group of people who are likely to be outraged and then launch a coordinated effort against their perceived enemies. While those people might think that they all coincidentally and organically stumbled upon the incendiary fake news article, in fact, it was a deceitful ploy specifically targeting them. They are mere pawns being moved by an unseen hand.
So, if all of this is right, if we do think that free speech can be inhibited by these sources of censorship, one of the important questions we should wrangle with is, what should we do about it, morally speaking? In general, we created protections against censorship in the old sense, in which there were relatively few informational bottlenecks, things such as laws, journalistic codes of ethics, independent watchdogs, mass education. But these protections will not be effective against the new emerging kinds of censorship.
A separate but related concern about the effects of the internet on free speech is the way in which modern media platforms odious ideas and concepts and make easier the dissemination of these things. Free speech is valuable, but it's one value among many, and one we have to think about its relation to other sorts of value.
Many folks argue that modern technology pits the value of free speech more starkly against our other values. For example, through many specific social media, Nazis and white supremacists talk and assemble with one another much more effectively and efficiently than they would have otherwise. Or, another example, it may be that the sort of speech fostered by the internet makes it much harder for us to have a generally knowledgeable public or open, informed, rational public dialogue, both of which seem like valuable things.
And pretentious nihilistic academics like Mark and Zach can conspire to make videos with one another more efficiently.
One other important question to ask would be, who is responsible for taking action in response to these worries? Individuals using the social media platforms? Companies creating or maintaining these platforms? Tufekci, for example, suggests that the brunt of the responsibility falls on governmental agencies and legislative bodies.
But that's what Tufekci thinks. What do you think?